Welcome to TechArts presents Over Simplified, the show where we take complicated audio, visual, and lighting concepts and break them down into understandable pieces.
In this episode of Over Simplified, we will continue our discussion of tracking by going over the various ways this concept affects cue editing.
Welcome to Over Simplified.
In the first video, we created this simple cue list to introduce the core concept of tracking on a professional lighting board. So if you haven't seen that video, check it out and come back here for part 2. Now we will be going over some terms and techniques that will take advantage of the core concept of tracking in the professional lighting board. So the first of those is something that we went over last video, but we will expand on it, and that is tracking. But we're going to divide that into two types of tracking. There's tracking forward, which is pretty much what we went over, but now there's tracking backwards. We're just going to take that concept but run it in reverse. Let's go over what that means, how to use it, and what pitfalls to look out for. So in this situation, again, we're dealing with this cue list and we're going over it with the client. So let's say we're going to be in Q4. We're taking a look at this look, and as we're talking with the client, they look at this and say, this LED uplight actually is a little too bright. I would like to bring that down to 50%. And so normally, of course, okay, say, great, I'll record that as 50%. But after talking with the client, what they really mean is they want it to be 50% the whole time, not 100%. So if we just recorded this here, we could then have to go back and record it here, etc. And we kind of went over this in the last video, where the solution to this problem using forward tracking is to go and find where in the cue list this was put at 100% and then change that to 50% so that it then tracks forward. The only issue with that really is that if you have a really large cue list, finding where that change happened to 100% can sometimes be just not really difficult, but a time-consuming process. Say you had 100 cues and this was somewhere in 50 and now you're in 60. Where did that happen? It could be, again, time-consuming to go through and find that, which is where tracking backwards comes into play. And that is done by, okay, you're in Q4 and you want to change it to 50%, but you want that to start at this point where this 100% came in. So you would set the light at 50%, but then tell the board to track it backwards. And what the board will do is it will do the legwork to go through the cues backwards until it finds where this change was made, and then it will record that information here for you so you don't have to find this particular cue. The result is the same as if you went back and did that, but it does it for you, which is really nice, and it can save you a lot of hassle and a lot of time. And then it, of course, tracks forward normally. And so that's the beauty of tracking backwards. It can save you some time when you're editing cues. Now this brings up another concept that you really need to be aware of, and it can get you into trouble when things aren't happening the way you expect them to, especially if it's a show that maybe you didn't do the original work on, or it's been a while since you've worked on it, whatever the case. And here's what happens and what to look for and how you can use it to your advantage if you want. So let's set this back to where we started. Say in Q4, 100%. Again, you're talking with the client and the client says, I want that at 50%. So you go ahead and write that as 50%. All is good, right? Well, then the client says, oh, no, I wanted that at the beginning where it started at 100%. Okay, using the original technique of going back to where this was changed, you go ahead and make that change. So then it will track through as expected through these, and it'll get to here, but it's the same information, so it doesn't really matter. It looks the same on stage, so you're doing all right. and then I will track through 50% the whole way. That's what the client wanted, right? Well, what you've done here is what we call a blocking cue. And what a blocking cue is, as it sounds, it prevents something from happening. It blocks something from happening. And what it's doing is blocking the tracking from happening. And what a blocking cue is anytime you have information in a cue that is identical to information in a previous cue, this is called a blocking cue. And this can be either very helpful or very detrimental, depending upon what you want. The important thing is you understand what is going on. And so here's what's going to happen. Again, when you see this 50% track through and you're sitting here on Q4, it looks like the cue is tracking that 50% from the first cue through this cue. But that's not true, because then if you went back to Q1 and changed that back to the 100% it was, or to any other value, it would track forward like you expect, track like you expect. In Q4, it's now 50%. Well, it looked like it was tracking through, but it wasn't really. So this blocking cue then can be a surprise if you didn't know it was there. And so it's really important to understand how your board handles these kind of blocking cues. A lot of times it will mark it in a different color with a special letter to let you know that there's a blocking cue. And there's also something that you can do called unblocking. And unblocking is where you take a cue list and you ask the lighting board to look at it and remove any duplicate information. It would see that this is duplicated information. And if you tell it to unblock it, it would then remove this from that cue. So then now it's a true tracking. There's no blocking getting in the way. So if you change that, it would track through as expected. Sometimes blocking is exactly what you want. You're looking at Q4 and you say, I want this to be at 50%. And it's really important for the look of this cue that this is at 50%, not tracking through from what came before it. And so then in this situation where you do want it to remain at 50%, say you went and changed this to 75%, which would then, again, track through nicely as it's supposed to, but then this blocking cue no longer looks like the same tracking because you wanted it to block, you wanted it to look like this. And so by leaving this blocking information, you ensure that Q4 will always have this at 50%. And then this is no longer considered a blocking cue because it's not identical information anymore. Again, this is something that you just need to be aware of, whether you want this to happen or not to happen. If you understand this concept and the board doesn't track through as you expected, most likely culprit is a blocking cue. The next concept that we're going to talk about is marking. And marking is a concept where we are again asking the console to do some work for us to make our lives easier. And this is what it looks like. So if we go into Q3, we have the moving light at the drum position at 0%. And then on Q4, we push play and the light comes up to 100% and moves to the speaker position. And we're going to see these things happening at the same time. It's going to start at 0% and go to 100% while moving from the drums to the speaker position. And sometimes you want to see that movement, but a lot of times you would just like it to be a seamless transition where it just comes up on the speaker position. So one way to do that would be to write another cue where after this cue, there's a cue where it moves this. And here's the key word that we're working with, in the dark. Anytime something moves at 0%, it's called moving in the dark. And so we could create like a Q3.5 where that moves in the dark. And then when we go to Q4, it just is a smooth transition of the light coming up, but we don't see it move. But if we use marking, we ask the console to do that work for us. And if a cue is marked, what happens is the console looks at this and sees, oh, this moving light's at 0%. In the next cue, it's at 100% and it moves somewhere else. So we push play on Q3, goes to 0%, console looks ahead and says, aha, it will move the light to that position. It's not writing information into the cue, it's just looking ahead and moving this in the dark so that it's pre-setting this cue, so when this comes up to 100%, you don't see the light move. And this can be real powerful, because if at some point in this cue you say, you know what, we don't want this to be on the speaker, we actually want it on the second podium that we have. Well, in this case, this wasn't, like I said, not actually written into the cue. This is just phantom information. The board will then automatically go to 0%, look ahead, oh, now it's in podium, move the light to the podium position, and then when you push play on 4, it will come up without you seeing any motion. And that's a great way, because then if you change your mind again, this goes back to the speaker. Well, this is not actually written into the cue. The lighting board will automatically play this and then move this in the dark to get it ready for the next cue, and that's marking. This is where you really need to understand how your board handles this, because I'll let you in on where this can be confusing to you, and things can happen that you're really not expecting. And here's what happens. You play into Q3, goes to 0%. The board looks ahead, sees that you want to go to the speaker, so it automatically moves it. Again, it hasn't written this information into the cue, it's just doing this to prepare for this cue. But while you're in this cue, you, for whatever reason, want to bring up the lights on the drums where the cue should be at. So you bring it up to 50%, but the light comes up on the speaker position because the board has moved it. And this can become really confusing, and you really have to understand how your board operates, because if you record this 50% into this cue, this isn't real. So when you push play again, when you set it up, you saw the light on the speaker, but again, not real information. The light will come up on the drums. So if you understand how the board thinks, you will understand this. But depending upon how your board handles it, maybe it will record it. This is something that you're going to have to look into yourself and figure this out. But knowing that that's a situation, you can prepare for it and use it to your advantage. And so that's marking and moving in dark. And the last concept is something that we touched on briefly in the previous video, and that is recording cue only. And recording cue only really is exactly what it sounds like. You're recording only for that cue. And what that means is this. So let's go back to the situation where we had in the start, where we're on Q4 and we want to change this to 50%. And if we do that, of course, it will dutifully track forward into the next cue as it's supposed to. But we don't want that to happen. We want this to be looking like this. And how we do that is when we record this information into the cue, we tell the lighting board, I want to record this in this cue only. And so what happens then is that the board then automatically looks ahead, looks to what the information was before we made the change, and records that into the next cue. Therefore, this information is recorded into this cue only, and the board automatically reverts this cue to what it was before. Now, this is actually writing this information into this cue. This is no longer tracked information. This is hard-coded information. So if we went all the way back to Q1 and changed that to 75%, this is hard-coded to 100%. It's not like tracking around the previous cue. This has become a hard-written value. So as long as you understand how the board is handling this information, this wouldn't then be a surprise. This isn't referencing any previous cue. It's now a hard-written value. Now, there are ways to do that where you have a separate reference. Those are called palettes, but that is no longer oversimplified. So this is going to get you started, and if you understand these concepts, you are well on your way to knowing what you're doing and being confident. So get to it.